Good evening. I'm Catherine Soul, and I'm the president of the Phi Beta Kappa Society, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening to the Book Awards ceremony. I'll have to say that this is a bit of a bittersweet occasion for me because this is the last Book Award ceremony which I will be the president. And it's been a wonderful event, and I hope that you all have a wonderful time this evening. I am going to turn this platform over right away to John Churchill, who's the secretary of the Phi Beta Kappa, and he's going to commence with the program. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kate. And congratulations on a lovely meeting of the Phi Beta Kappa Senate this afternoon. I want to thank all of you senators for your support as well. I want to take a few minutes just to place the Phi Beta Kappa Book Awards in the context of the Society's mission of recognizing excellence. These awards have been presented annually for a half century and more now to outstanding books in the fields of the humanities, the social sciences, and the natural sciences and mathematics. Phi Beta Kappa has honored outstanding books over the years, and you'll see that this year is no exception. Before I introduce our Master of Ceremonies for the evening, I'd like to take the opportunity to recognize the Phi Beta Kappa Senate's Awards Committee and thank them for their unstinting service to Phi Beta Kappa in the backdrop of this event this evening. Chair of that committee is Senator Peter Quimby. Other members who are here are Senator Todd Breyfogle and Senator Valerie Hotchkiss. We're very much in your debt for your service. And I also want to thank Associate Secretary Ronnie Roa and Coordinator of Administration Laura Hartnett of the Phi Beta Kappa National Office for their work in making this night possible. Now to start the exciting part of the evening, it's my pleasure to introduce our Master of Ceremonies, noted author and critic Michael Dirda. We're delighted to have Michael again with us this year as Master of Ceremonies. His lively commentary and astute observations last year added a great deal to our event. He's a winner of the Pulitzer Prize for Distinguished Criticism, a book critic for the Washington Post. He's a former writer and senior editor for the late lamented Washington Post Book World. Michael's love of books extends to writing them as well. In his most recent book on Conan Doyle, The Whole Art of Storytelling, won the Edgar Allan Poe Award for 2012's Best Critical Biographical Work from the Mystery Writers of America. Michael's also a freelance book reviewer, feature writer, and essayist. He graduated with highest honors in English from Oberlin College, spent a year in advanced study in France at the Université d'Aix-en-Provence, and earned his master's and PhD at Cornell in comparative literature. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Michael Dirda.
Thank you, John, for those generous words. First of all, can you all hear me? It's okay? If you can't, signal wildly, and I might see you. And I'll make the microphone come closer to my lips. I was asked to set the tone for the evening, which is always a difficult thing to do because it's hard to know what the tone should be. But I thought that I could talk about familiar subjects like will e-books replace real books? Or will Amazon and Hachette ever really resolve their problems? Or will the Washington Post Book World ever come back? And I can answer that one, no. But instead I thought I would talk a little bit about a cause that has always been near to my heart as a reviewer and as a writer about books. That is the urging of people to read beyond the bestseller list, to read books of some ambition that are difficult, perhaps, demanding, that require us to expand our horizons when we open them. Too often it seems to me that we are content just to follow the current books that are popular, and we will consequently miss books that will speak to us in very profound ways because we just haven't explored and found them. This is one reason why I think independent bookstores are so important, because they offer a place where you can browse the bookshelves, pick up books, read a little bit of, of each of them and find something that you might enjoy, rather than simply relying on what's popular, what you've heard about. I mean, one of the reasons that these awards are so valuable is that they do draw attention for this evening, for us and for others, to such valuable books. In the case of the winner of the Christian Gauss Award, Steve Moore, his book is immensely entertaining. Some of you may have seen it out in the lobby or have seen it in the bookshops. It looks like this monstrous, brick of a book, 1,000 pages. And it is that, but every page will offer you something that will make you smile, make you laugh, might annoy you, but you will find yourself becoming excited by the books that Steve writes about. His work is a great work of rediscovery, of reclamation. He's gone beyond the orthodoxies that many of us who are English majors grew up with, that the novel began with Cervantes and Defoe. He shows that in his first volume that the novel has an ancient history. He shows in this book and others that there are novels from around the world that many of us may not have heard of, but that are funny, sexy, enjoyable, and that may speak to us if we just give them a try. And because of Steve's work, he manages to make you so excited by what he describes that you want to rush out and read An Ethiopian Story, which is an antique romance, or Grimmelshausen's Simplicissimus, which is the kind of the foundational novel of German literature. He describes it in a characteristic note as being like the pedal point that begins Wagner's Das Rheingold. He's incredibly funny. I mean, where else in a critic, you have a critic who's going to talk about a pea-goat. You know what a pea-goat is? A pea-goat, a P-G-O-A-T. It's from David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest. It's prettiest girl of all time. And he mentions that there are 4 of them in one episode of Don Quixote. He also makes fun of our, he stresses that the Don Quixote is not a kind of Abbott and Costello on the country inn circuit in Andalusia, that it's a different kind of book, a more profound book, a book about books. And when you finish reading anything that Steve writes, and some of you may know his reviews in the Post, you want to rush out and get the book. Because why do we read? What's the reason we read? We read for excitement. That's the only reason we really read. There are all kinds of excitement. There can be the excitement we find in best-selling action novels or 50 Shades of Grey or what have you. But there is also kind of intellectual excitement. And that's the kind of excitement that is celebrated in these awards tonight. We have all these pieces of paper here, which I'm not looking at. I mean, David Nirenberg, is it Nirenberg? It sounds good. I mean, it could be Nirenberg. Nirenberg is better? Even better. I mean, when you take a book like Anti-Judaism, this is an incredibly ambitious book. At the very end, David, if I may so call him, likens a model of his to Erich Auerbach's famous book, Mimesis, The Representation of Reality in Western Literature, a book that might also have inspired the novel, An Alternative History. It covers basically Western history and sort of Middle Eastern history too, from antiquity to the present. It talks about the representation of the Jew, sometimes not even the real Jew, but of sort of a metaphorical Jew, as the other, as an enemy of established Christianity or Islam or conventions, but explores this kind of dualism in Western thought. It's a demanding book, but it's the kind of ambitious book that too often scholars don't write anymore. They narrow in, focus on their one little subject, but this takes, all history for its province and has found a way to make us see it in a new manner through a kind of a template that we didn't know was there, but once it's been shown to us, we see it everywhere. But we'll talk more about this in the question period. Let me pause right here just to say there will be questions during our conversation, and I encourage you as you enjoy dinner tonight to think about what you might want to ask our award winners to discuss. It's really an evening for you as well as for them. The last book, I think that the award ceremonies like this reminds me of the whole function of a liberal arts education, to prepare to keep you learning throughout life, to give you a foundation so that you can read sometimes difficult books. As a certain sleuth of Baker Street used to say, education never ends, Watson. And I think that's true for all of us who are alive to the world, to ideas, to books, to learning. We want to keep learning new things. And so that when we hear about awards like the Phi Beta Kappa Award in Science or the Christian Gauss Award or Ralph Waldo Emerson Award, we know these are books we might want to explore. In the case of Douglas Stone's Einstein and the Quantum, I've read a couple of biographies of Einstein, but they all tend to focus on the man's outward life, public life, his joie de vivre, his illegitimate daughter, his mistresses, his conservatism in later years, his conversion to Zionism. But surely in the case of Einstein, this is one instance where it's the thought that counts. And here is a book where we examine the thought. You'll need to go slowly, but it's because it's a book that has a difficult subject. If quantum mechanics, if it were easy, we wouldn't need to have Stephen Hawking. But because of Stone's careful effort to illuminate this difficult but essential subject, a kind of the central science of our time, things become a little bit clearer for us. We learn if we're willing to slow down. It's all three of these books in their different ways are challenging and wonderful. After all, a great book is a book that makes us see ourselves and the world differently. Sometimes the greatest books make us feel uncomfortable, make us feel off kilter. It's because they ask us to break out of our comfort zone. But I think that's one function that as readers we should always bear in mind. It's important to read for pleasure, for excitement, as I said, but every so often we should try to stretch ourselves and explore new areas, new books, to keep ourselves alive and not become stuck in a rut, stagnant. Too often we expect books today to aspire to not to the condition of music, but to the condition of television. We want them just to wash over us as easily as possible. And we give nothing back in return. But a real book is something that you have to work with. It can be both like a love affair and break your heart, but it also can be like Jacob wrestling with the angel, and we don't let go until we are blessed. And this is also one reason why I'll make a final pitch before I let us begin our dinner, for actual physical books as opposed to e-books. Physical books, real books, books like this are books that you read with a pencil in your hand. You can mark the margins, you can scribble thoughts, you can make the book your own. And when it's done, you put it on a bookshelf in your house, and it remains a part of your life. It's not like a text on an e-reader, which is just there. I'm interested in books, not just texts. There's a function for that, but if you have a book on your shelf, it speaks to you day after day, reminds you, well, you haven't read me yet, or it's time to reread me. I mean, it's there. You can't avoid it. And you can't have that with just an e-reader, which is just this blank screen. I mean, the other aspect of reading on screens, of course, is the whole impulse of our computer age is for speed. Everything has to be instant messengering, fast internet, speed. But real books, we don't need to read fast. We can sometimes, but we read them at the pace they demand, the pace that works for us. Reading itself should be a sustained act of attention. And it's the experience we enjoy itself. It's not something we have to get through as fast as we possibly can. That's if you're a real reader. So I think that this is why real books have an important place in our lives, not only because of bookshops and their value. I mean, I always judge a city by the number of its used bookshops, and cities have been going downhill, let me tell you, in recent years. But also by just the company of books the way they enhance our lives. After all, and I think it's time to stop. I mean, a personal library, and it's not just a reflection of who we are, but it's a reflection of who we'd like to be. So enjoy our dinner. Afterwards, we will have the awards ceremony, and then we will have a discussion for a certain length of time, where we'll alternate questions among the four of us, but we do encourage questions from the floor. There will be a microphone circulating, and really, this is your chance to grill these characters. Hello? Hello, can anyone hear me? Attention. Quiet. Peaceful quiet. Enjoy this moment of silence. We now come to the important part of the evening, at least for many of us, and for you as well, I think. We will have the presentation of the 3 awards to our honored recipients, and we will follow that with a conversation among the 4 of us and you. So, to begin, I would like to ask Suzanne Keene, the Dean of the College at Washington and Lee, to come up and present the award to Stephen Moore. We will then follow immediately with the other 2 awards. I won't come back up here until the very end. Okay? Are we set? Enjoy.
The Christian Gauss Award is the oldest of the 3 Phi Beta Kappa Book Awards. It was established by the Phi Beta Kappa Senate in 1950 to recognize outstanding books in the field of literary scholarship or criticism. The award is named for the late Christian Gauss, the distinguished Princeton University scholar, teacher, and dean, who also served as senator and president of Phi Beta Kappa. The winning title of the Phi Beta Kappa Christian Gauss Award is the novel, An Alternative History, 1600 to 1800, by Stephen Moore. It was published by Bloomsbury Academic. Booklist describes Moore's work this way. In the most comprehensive history of this period ever written, Moore examines over 400 novels from around the world in a lively style that is as entertaining as it is informative. Though written for a general audience, the novel, An Alternative History, also provides the scholarly apparatus required by the serious student of the period. This sequel, like its predecessor, is a zestfully encyclopedic, avidly opinionated, and dazzlingly fresh history of the most elastic of literary forms, and that's what Booklist had to say. Here's my view. It is an extraordinary book, a project reminiscent of the megalomaniacal 19th century endeavors like the Dictionary of National Biography or the OED. Unlike those encyclopedic works, though, the novel and alternative history is the accomplishment of just one man. I cannot even begin to estimate how many years or decades went into the reading that lies behind the pages of Stephen Moore's The Novel. I used to be proud that I had read all 47 of Anthony Trollope's novels, that I could warn you off the one really wretched one, and give a sad little smile at the 10 not really worth your time. I stand before you a chastened character, a mere Padawan who bows before a Jedi master of novel reading. The novel and alternative history combines a strong point of view. Moore loves novels written in the Shandian spirit of Lawrence Sterne and a broad casting of the net. This book does not replicate the anorexic canon of a great tradition or a semester-constrained syllabus. It encompasses multiple national traditions and subgenres. Though few will consult this book for thoroughgoing interpretations of most of the novels Moore evaluates, many will read sections of it to orient or reorient themselves to subfields, national traditions, and modes. Others will approach it in the spirit of pure discovery. I learned a lot from Moore about fiction from Asia, including works that other critics might not even call novels. On the one hand, Moore has an extraordinarily capacious definition of the novel. If you're a relatively long, mostly prose narrative fiction, you're in. And on the other hand, he proffers the kind of acute judgment that I associate with Sports Center. Okay, guys, Jimmy Graham is obviously the best tight end playing in the NFL, but how does he stack up against Tony Gonzalez or Mark Bavaro? Discuss. In the realm of the novel, Moore never stops judging, weighing, and sometimes smacking down prior critical opinions, advocating, giving brisk thumbs up and thumbs down. Writing about Marivaux's The Virtuous Orphan, Moore offers this appraisal. With Marianne, European fiction finally achieves the psychological maturity of the best medieval Japanese fiction. Take that, Eurocentric tastemakers. The Gauss Prize Committee especially admired the potential of Moore's work to appeal to educated general readers. Its humor plays a significant role in extending its reach. The novel and alternative history is a hoot. 9 pages into Moore's opening critique of Cervantes, I was laughing out loud. Moore's irreverent wit and authorial asides, occasionally plaintive but normally ebullient, provide the trail of breadcrumbs that lead the beguiled reader into and back out of the forest. The Gauss judges agreed that as long as there are still readers of the novel, Moore's study will serve as an indispensable guide to the field. Gotta flip the page. Stephen Moore is an author, literary critic, editor, and authority on late novelist William Gaddis, on whom his next book is written. The novel is the second of 2 volumes examining the history of the novel. And now please welcome Stephen Moore. You're very welcome. Here you go. Okay, we're good to go.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, for that wonderful introduction. I wish you had been assigned a book to review for the New York Times. Of all the literary awards out there, the Christian Goss one has the most personal resonance for me because Dean Goss was not only the mentor to 2 writers I really admire, F. Scott Fitzgerald and Edmund Wilson, he was also the mentor to the late novelist W.M. Spackman, who was Princeton class of 27. I've not only edited Spackman's works for publication, but Spackman actually dedicated one of his books to Dean Gauss. So this kind of establishes me in some kind of triangulated way with a marvelous set of writers. So again, there are a lot of awards out there, but this one has a special resonance for me, especially when I look at the list of previous winners. It's basically a who's who of all the best literary critics of the last 60 years. I suspect sometimes I just made some kind of mistake. I shouldn't even be here. I mean, that's how good the list is. Also, as you may have gleaned from Suzanne's remarks, this isn't your standard academic book, nor am I an academic. I mean, I do have a PhD, but I'm what they call an independent scholar. We're sort of the gypsies of the academic world, and as such, we don't often get much attention. So I think it was a very bold choice on the part of the judges to pick a book like this and an author like me, and it sends out a great message to everyone, to other writers out there. Finally, I really have to thank my editor, Harris Knockvey of Bloomsbury, whom I invited to join me here. Without him, I literally would not be standing here, because this is a 1,000-page book that hardly anyone ever touched. He not only accepted the book, he didn't ask for any cuts or changes. He let me put a naked lady on the cover. I mean, it just, what more could you ask for an editor? So, to Harris, to the judges, to Phi Beta Kappa, thank you for this astounding award. This is the highlight of my life. Thank you.
Tip this down or you'd never hear me. So the Phi Beta Kappa Award in Science was established 55 years ago to provide and encourage literary and scholarly interpretations of math, the biological sciences, and as with this year's winning title, the physical sciences. This is a real challenge, I think, for many in society to read science books that are really so compelling. This year's winning title of the Phi Beta Kappa Award in Science is Einstein and the Quantum, The Quest of the Valiant Schwabian by A. Douglas Stone, published by Princeton University Press. This book is a compelling blend of physics, biography, and the history of science. Einstein and the Quantum shares the untold story of how Einstein, not Max Planck or Niels Bohr, was the driving force behind quantum theory. It paints a vivid portrait of this iconic scientist as he grappled with the really contradictory nature of light, physics, the interpretation of particle or wave, a big argument. But he grappled with this in a really compelling way. He was the driving force behind the development of early quantum theory. The constituents, the light and the particles really defy our understanding in a way that we can think about it, of something being the same thing, two things, different things, but the same thing. It demonstrates how Einstein's later work on atomic light, on the emission of absorption of light on atomic gases, led directly to Schrodinger's equation, which probably many of you have seen. I hope some of you have seen Schrodinger's equation in its modern form. The book sheds light on why Einstein ultimately renounced his own brilliant work in quantum mechanics as a violation of his deep belief in the nature of physics and the nature of science, as something objective and eternal. The famous quote, he said, "God does not play dice with the universe." But it seems like God really does play dice with the universe. As an astrophysicist, I play with the Planck function every day. Black body emission of light is the part and parcel of how we interpret the universe. It's what we look at to understand the nature of the objects we see, the temperatures of objects, the compositions of objects, everything relates to Planck's equation. And this book describes in just magnificent, beautiful detail how we begin to understand the origin of light from stars, not just from black bodies, the everyday things that we see in the physics lab or in the universe around us, but the stars themselves. It wasn't until I read this book that I really began to understand at a deep level the connection between the black body spectrum that I study and the nature of light, the origin of light, and the work in early quantum mechanics, how those all relate and play together. This book, it's amazing to say this about a book on physics, but this book has changed my life. It has really informed me about the origin of the very ideas that allow us to understand and interpret the universe. I teach a course on stellar atmospheres to graduate students, And it's these equations that Einstein developed that guide us in everything we do to understand the universe out there. And this book helps us understand how those ideas came to be and how they relate to the world in which we live. It's a magnificent portrait of Einstein and of the early 20th century developments in physics in a way that I would never have believed possible. It is truly magnificent. If you haven't read it, I truly, truly encourage you to do so. It's just beautiful. Douglas Stone is the chair of Applied Physics Department at Yale University and the director of Yale's Division of Physical Sciences. Please welcome Doug Stone.
You're supposed to smile, right?
Yes, we're supposed to smile.
Thank you very much. So I think they said they were going to turn it on at the back. Or use this? Well, okay. There's supposed to be a leveler one, but I'll be multi-mic'd. Okay, so I really want to thank Phi Beta Kappa for this wonderful recognition as a first-time author, to have my name added to the illustrious list along with the greatest writers about science from the last half century is just an enormous honor for which I am deeply grateful. I have several day jobs. I have to do research as well as teaching, and I'm also doing a certain amount of administration. So this project took a few years to complete. 7, of course, I guess it's probably nothing for you, but anyway. So I do want to first thank the people who kept me going and encouraged me. So let me begin with, at the very beginning of the project, Walter Isaacson, the noted biographer, really told me, yes, I can do this. I'll get you connected. He's good at that kind of thing. And Martin Klein, a very distinguished historian and physicist at Yale, who's now sadly deceased, told me, well, basically I agree with what you're saying. And that was pretty important because he's the person I respect probably most in this field. Then when I signed on with Princeton University Press, Ingrid Nerlich and her team, Jessica Pauline, et cetera, worked very, very well with me. And Ingrid really understood, she's my editor, I should say, understood that the book was supposed to work on 2 levels. It was supposed to be something that lay science enthusiasts could get into and get the flavor of Einstein's thought. And there are very few equations, almost none in the book, just so you know. But on the other hand, I've had so many professional physicists and scientists come up to me and say, you know, I didn't know the origin story behind all these things I use, and it's so different and so much more interesting than I had imagined. Okay. A critical person in all of this that I've done is my father, who's here tonight, Alan Stone. He's my intellectual inspiration, and he read all the drafts. And even though his training is in psychiatry and he works at Harvard Law School, he's managed to teach about film and literature for the last 2 decades and gotten away with it. So, also my mother, who is not able to be here, who's passed away, was a poet, and we were a very literary family, I would say. And it really inspired me to try late in my career to become a man of letters, which maybe I'm inching towards. And finally, my wife, Mary, who's been my companion in all these adventures and was really my emotional inspiration through all of this and, you know, helped edit me and make it all get easier and easier, hopefully. So let me just say a little bit about the book. My checkered background was not reviewed, but I was actually an undergraduate major in social studies at Harvard. And then I did physics and philosophy at Oxford before I actually decided to become a physicist. And I wrote a good deal, and I enjoyed writing, and I enjoyed the use of language. And sadly, you don't get to use language in the same way when you write scientific papers, in the same way of sort of whimsy and creativity. So I had missed that. And another thing that came from that background of coming to physics late is I remember learning physics as an outsider, not knowing the language, and remembering that, hey, not everybody really knows what a, you know, I don't know, what a what the curl function does, or what what a differential equation is. Maybe the curl function is something different to different people. But anyway, anyway, so I did remember that, and I always thought I should try at some point to communicate across the divide now that I speak physics. And I was searching for an appropriate topic, and I have things that I've done and things that I'm interested in my subfield, but nothing kind of grabbed me. And then just sort of serendipitously, in 2004, I discovered, and I go a little bit through this in my book, so I won't do it here, that actually there was an enormous lacuna in the literature for readers about Einstein. In fact, now that I've come here tonight, I could have used a different title for it. I could have said Einstein and Alternative History. But anyway, so it turns out that his role in atomic theory has been systematically misrepresented, underappreciated, and ignored. And since understanding the atom was the turning point in modern science, that there was a point around 1900 where we knew there were atoms, but we had no idea what the physical laws were that determined how they behaved, how they emitted light, et cetera. And it just wasn't clear. It was clear that Newtonian physics wasn't working, but it wasn't clear we would ever be able to understand this. And this incredible saga of discovery happened over the first 25 years of the 20th century, and Einstein was at the center of it. So this seemed like a good topic that people might be interested in, and so I embarked on this. And my method, as I say, was to weave together biography, explanation of the science at a non-mathematical level mainly, and history, hopefully to make a compelling narrative. Now, it is true there are hard parts. Sometime when I feel like getting people's attention, I say, look, this isn't rocket science, this is really hard. But anyway, but it's actually not that hard. You can really get the flavor of it. Give it a shot in my book. And I was really aided in this by the fact that Einstein turned out to be a really entertaining guy. His wit, his passion, his wisdom as he aged made it really interesting to read 2,000 pages of his letters and to cull the things that would fit into my story. And I really let him speak as much as possible through his quotations. So it also did give me a chance to use a little whimsy and use a little bit of a, maybe say sort of dramatic devices in writing that I don't get to do normally. So let me give you one quick example. A turning point in the history of understanding the atom was the Solvay Conference of 1911. A Belgian magnate who was a soda, he invented soda, I guess, or using industrial process for extracting soda, had funded an elite conference of the greatest minds. It's considered the most elite science conference in the history of science. 15 Nobel Prize winners out of 30, et cetera. Einstein was the youngest one there. And that's when they really began to understand that there was a crisis in understanding the atom. But Einstein had been understood that now for 6 years, so he was already bored with this. So anyway, I thought, well, how am I going to get, I'm going to do this linearly, how am I going to get into this? And I discovered that Solvay, who had funded the thing, of course, was asked to speak first. And he had his own nutty theories of the atom that were totally wacky. But he was the donor, so he speaks. And so he starts off and he says all this stuff. So I decide I'm just going to land the reader in this unknown guy standing up and talking this way, cubifiable, quantifiable space, and just let them wonder whether I'm really serious. Am I supposed to understand this or not? And then eventually it dawns on them that, oh no, this guy's actually it's the time-honored tradition of humoring the wealthy donor, the wealthy patron. So I don't get to do that when I write for Physical Review letters. I don't actually get to intentionally confuse the reader before I unconfuse them. So that's the kind of fun thing that I did in the book, and I think people eventually did appreciate about it. So after this conference, where the greatest minds of the century pondered about this, Einstein wrote to his friend Michele Besso, "The Congress itself resembled the lamentations on the ruins of Jerusalem. I did not find it very stimulating because I did not hear anything I did not already know. So he was kind of a feisty guy, and I enjoyed reading these kinds of things. Anyway, in many ways, Einstein exemplifies the scientist as creator and artist. It was very inspirational to spend these 7 years in his world and eventually producing something I could share with you. So let me close with something Einstein said about another scientist, but I think it applies very well to him. He said, "The man loved mysterious nature as a lover loves his distant beloved. In his day, there did not exist the dull specialization that stares with self-conceit through horn-rimmed glasses and destroys poetry." So, thank you very much for this award.
The Ralph Waldo Emerson Award was established in 1960 to recognize studies that contribute significantly to historical, philosophical, or religious interpretations of the human condition. The winner of the Phi Beta Kappa Ralph Waldo Emerson Award is Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition by David Nirenberg. It was published by W.W. Norton and Company. This incisive history upends the complacency that confines anti-Judaism to the ideological extremes in the Western tradition. With deep learning and elegance, David Nirenberg shows how foundational anti-Judaism is to the history of the West. This is a readable and learned book supporting the thesis that anti-Judaism is, or should be, a term describing a process by which actual Jews are subordinated or effaced, almost entirely, by extra-ethnic descriptions that construct Jews as a particularly offensive kind of other. The book is ambitious, erudite, and insightful study of this important trope over the course of some 3,000 years, including detailed studies of Egypt, Christendom, the Quran, Inquisition Spain, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the most challenging section for me, modern philosophy. An example where the argument becomes particularly interesting for me as a medievalist is when Nirenberg demonstrates that medieval Europeans' anti-Judaism persisted and even became more inflamed in the absence of any actual Jews, such as when sermons supporting the expulsion of Jews from England continued to be written during the century after their actual expulsion. It is a work of deep scholarly research on a vast scale and scope. The book emphasizes that thoughts matter, concepts can be historical drivers, working understandings and frames of reference evolve over time and condition future understandings. This is a study that believes in the power of ideas without granting ideas a pseudo-agency apart from historical actors. As one of my colleagues noted, this is a very Emersonian book. And our books arrived in the summer, so this was one of my beach reads while my cousins were reading 50 Shades of Grey, and I think I had the better choice. David Nirenberg is the Deborah R. and Edgar DiGiannata Professor of Medieval History and Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago, and the Dean of Social Sciences Division at the University of Chicago. Please welcome David Nirenberg.
I don't think that Jennifer Edwards was introduced, and she's an associate professor of medieval history at Manhattan College and a great historian herself, so her introduction means a huge amount to me. I didn't know who I was going to thank, but I have to thank Douglas Stone, because I began as a molecular biophysics major at Yale, and Yale's applied physics department is a good reason why I'm a historian and standing before you today. Having said that, I think it's customary to thank your agent, your publisher, your parents, your wife, not necessarily in that order, your spouse. But actually, and I would thank all those, I do thank all those people, but it takes a world to produce a book. It takes a world and a history, a long history of scholars, of students, of librarians, and of libraries, even of webmasters and Wikipedia, what are they called? the ones who edit it anonymously and cut your beautiful, beloved biography out because they say it's an ad. Knowledge is the product of millions, hundreds of millions, billions by now of people working together to create it. In that sense, and it takes readers, because no book is happy without readers. I think your line about books whispering to you, you haven't read me yet. Books are like genies in bottles. The longer you take to read them, the angrier they get at you. So it takes scholars, students, librarians, webmasters, readers, it takes a world to make a book. And this is why I think the ancient philosophers, Aristotle, Averroes, Ibn Rushd, talked about the collective intellect. They thought of the intellect as something that was made up of everyone who's ever struggled for knowledge, who's ever wanted to know and worked to know. And the sum of all that knowledge is something that they thought was immortal. The collective intellect they thought of as the only form of immortality available to us. They were wrong. The collective intellect, knowledge is not immortal. It takes our constant effort to maintain it. And that's why I really want to thank you, because I think the Phi Beta Kappa Society has been a part of that effort in this country since the founding of this country, and that it has oriented itself toward the value of knowledge. Excellence, yes, but excellence in knowledge, academic excellence, not necessarily excellence in football. I know what you're thinking. This book prize and the book prizes at the Phi Beta Kappa Society awards orient our attention towards a certain value, and it's a value that we can't take for granted. It's a value that I think, and I think you were making in your comments as well, is to some degree embattled. So I want to thank you for that. This value of books is especially important for anyone who works on what I work on. I work on the people of the book. The people of the book is a name used in Islam to describe Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and sometimes, well, not Muslims, but we use it now to include Muslims, and sometimes Zoroastrians, but people bound together by a common scriptural tradition. And what binds them together isn't that they all agree on that scriptural tradition, it's that they're all reading and rereading and writing and thinking about those books constantly. And it's out of that reading and rereading and thinking about those books, and many cultures are not about the book, about those books that so much of our history, the history of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, has been created. And that's, of course, what I wrote about in Anti-Judaism, which is a book about how, by thinking about Hebrew scripture, the world came to constitute itself as it has. But I write about that in any book I write on. That's my topic. And I think it's a topic that's of great importance. Books and the people of the book are of great importance for us today as we find ourselves in a moment, not the first moment, not the last moment, one of many, many moments, in which how people read and think about reading those sacred books has a lot to do with how the world understands itself. We live in a moment in which many Americans understand themselves by thinking about, or sometimes fearing, Islam. Many Europeans look at Islam and Judaism and think certain things. Many Muslims think about America or think about Zionism and define themselves that way. We live in a world in which the people of the book and how they read the book is of huge importance. And all too often, the way in which we read books is governed by ignorance. That is, it's not the product of a struggle for knowledge, but rather the product of an attempt to hold on to unexamined beliefs or disseminate those beliefs. I think that we live in an age in which attention to books, all books, and also to the sacred books, to the history of our reading and to the role that reading plays in how we constitute ourselves as societies is really important. And that's why I really want to thank you again. That I think that the Phi Beta Kappa Society is one of the last places in our great society in which this value of reading, writing, studying, knowledge is the value at the core of the activity. Which is all to say that this is a great honor for me. I would never have seen anything in my biography that would have anticipated putting me here except the fact that as a 3-year-old, I played a lot at Walden Pond. and I'm very grateful to you.
You will remember that at the beginning of the program, I asked you all to think about questions you might like to ask our award winners. Well, now we're about to start the conversation. This will be your opportunity to ask questions of all of them together or individually. Try to make the questions of the sort where we all can contribute here. But I have some of my own to start the ball rolling. So if Steve, Doug, and David will join me here on the podium. Are we all set? First of all, can you all hear me? It all works? Everyone else?
Is
Okay.
this check, check. Is this working?
Okay.
Microphone working?
Now I have a number of questions. I'm not sure we'll get to all of them. We'll try. This will be fairly free form. But since I'm a book reviewer, I was wondering if you were asked, each of you, to review your own books, what would you want to stress about them? What strengths do you think they hold? What weaknesses do you think they have? What would you do differently? Anyone like to start? Or shall I call on you, as teachers say? I'm going to call on you, Mr. Moore. You're a professional book reviewer.
The first thing I'd praise is the universal scope. Every history of the novel, go to the library and look them up. They're all about England, America, and the continent. Everyone else is ignored. And yet, the Chinese wrote fabulous novels back in the Ming era. Japanese wrote very sophisticated novels back in the Middle Ages. You can trace it back to ancient Greece. I mean, that's basically where I start with the ancient Greek novel. It was revived back in the Middle Ages. The Icelanders, they call them sagas, but some of the long book-length sagas are like fabulous novels. Novels, not sagas. So the fact that I have the international scope is the one thing I would praise. Now the fact that when you're dealing with those many books, you can't go into great depth, so it's a little superficial. So if I were a reviewer, I'd try to spin the superficiality into a better term. But that's the way I'd approach. I mean, the grand gesture.
What would you say about your style? Your style's filled with jokes, and you have footnotes where you say, Penelope Fitzgerald's The Blue Flower, much overrated. No point in reading Miguel de Unamuno's essays on Don Cervantes. They're all sorts of.
You can stop there.
Don Quixote, Living the Dream, which I thought was a brilliant touch.
Oh, thank you. Before I began this, I thought I'd have to write this in typical academic style, really boring and serious, and I kept dragging my feet, and I hate writing. I've written those kind of things in the past. Then I decided I'm just going to have fun with it. I'm going to write as if I'm writing to some smart friend of mine, and I have a sort of sarcastic turn of mind. So I figured if I had fun with it, the reader might have fun with it. Because I know it's a long book, a lot of what could be boring material. So I thought I'd just, make it lively, because that's the kind of stuff I like to read. I like to read stuff that's funny and witty and smart, as well as informative. It doesn't always have to be dead serious. So I figured I'd take a chance that if I had fun with it, the reader might have fun with it. So that's what I went
I mean,
for.
I really thought that the book was in some ways like an anatomy. It reminded me of Robert Burton's The Anatomy of Melancholy, a book where everything goes into it. Rants, quotations, reversals of judgment, kind of little digressions, summaries of wonderful books, put downs. It's a grab bag. And I think that's what makes it so much fun to read.
And like I said, I'm not an academic. They would never allow me to do that in a college. But exactly. And also, my favorite novels are like that. Don Quixote is that kind of novel, or Rabelais, or Thomas Pynchon. So I figured, as long as I love those kind of novels, why don't I, not write a novel, but write it in the spirit of those kind of novels. Tristram Shandy is the main one I've gone to. And if anyone's read Tristram Shandy, you know that anything goes there. So that was sort of my model. And again, I was taking a bit of a chance, but I found a publisher willing to take a chance, and apparently a few readers, and a company like this, organization like this willing to give me a prize for it. So I made a good choice.
Douglas?
Yeah. So I guess I would hope that a book reviewer would say that the book gave him or her a new appreciation of Einstein's genius and gave you some real flavor of how he thought. Because I really explained the paradoxes they were facing at the time, the things that just seemed to be paradoxical, and the courage it took him to do some of the things that I talk about in the book. At the point that he suddenly reopened the debate about whether light could be more like a particle than a wave, that was the point where the wave theory of light had been the most successful theory in physics for 40 years, and they had built radio based on it. So it was like not even, a theory. There was a whole technology. And so to have the courage to say, well, wait a sec, there's something still wrong with our theory of light, even though we've got this great technology based on it. So I try to bring that to light to explain what a wave is, how's the inconsistency between these two, and the courage it took. And one of his biographers says that's the most revolutionary sentence in the 20th century. Yeah. So so getting into the mind of Einstein, not the usual light beams in trains or elevators in empty space, which anybody who's a buff will have heard many times, but totally new things for people. I certainly hope they would notice that aspect of the book. The second thing is that quantum mechanics has become very trendy. There was Copenhagen, there's Arcadia, there's you name it, and people seem to think it's about cats being alive and dead, and it's not. Okay, we'll get back to that. And it's the theory of the atom. It's a quantitative theory. It's why we have all this technology. So this is like maybe the most important intellectual event in human history, at least in modern history. So in that sense, I wanted to say, look, this was like an earthquake, a seismic event in the intellectual history of the race, of the 20th century, et cetera. So I hope they would get that out of the book. Now, weakness is I was trying to do this dual track, and as you noted, it gets hard come somewhere in the middle, and in some sense it also picks up at the end. So I want to say to people, okay, you're going to have to do some slightly painful work between chapters, but 11 and 14. But then when Einstein gets famous, it gets fun again. Just hang on. There's some sugar coming. So it's hard to do both. But it does take work. But as you said, like Nabokov is a lot of work, and so on. So things that you have to work hard on to understand, right?
The thing about quantum mechanics, though, it has these wonderful phrases: Maxwell's demons, spooky action from a distance, and
yes,
and these all have this sort of romantic resonance. So people, can't help but gravitate to them. And so you do explain some of these. What is spooky action from a distance? You say it's the heart of quantum mechanics.
Oh, no, I don't say that.
You do too. I have page numbers right here.
Okay. Okay, well, we'll have to discuss this offline.
Well, we'll let you think about that. We'll go on to our third victim here.
Let me just say one thing about that. So there is something very, very strange that Einstein also discovered, and some people say he should have gotten the Nobel Prize for that. I'm up to about 9 for him. If you gave him for all the things he really deserved him for. And it is something, but it's not the focus of my book. It is incredibly important. It's what we study in my department right now. I mean, literally, there's a graduate student doing an experiment on this now with something we call Schrödinger cat states. So I'm not really ruling out the Schrödinger cats. So, and it has to do with the fact that somehow two very distant objects are affected by, if you measure one of them, you affect the other. And it's like two magic coins. If this one is heads, the distant one is always tails. And there's this perfect correlation at a distance. And Einstein thought it sort of violated relativity, but it doesn't. We know it doesn't, but he still hated it.
David.
Well, I think obviously I would have told more jokes in the book.
You can,
Although then I wouldn't have gotten the one snippet of review that I want for my tombstone, which was a grim masterpiece.
I have my tombstone picked out. It's going to be, if it's not one thing, it's another. But yes, okay, a grim masterpiece.
No, I think, no, humor aside, I think I'm with you that what I'm proud of, what I really wanted to do, and what is, I think, unusual in my world, in which historians cut things ever smaller to make them controllable. So you get people writing histories of Perugian wax seals between 1352 and 1355. That what I tried to do was treat history as a whole, and to treat, the German translation is called An Alternative History of Western Culture. In other words, to try do the whole thing. And I think that's...
We have an alternative history of the novel.
Exactly. What I'd do differently, I think, is, every book has to start somewhere, because books have to start, just like every sentence has to start somewhere. I defy you to find a sentence that doesn't start somewhere. There are sentences that never end, but they all start somewhere.
They start in the middle sometimes.
And
yeah, middle of a sentence.
it's still the beginning. And the problem is that where you start can give the impression that you are assigning responsibility for an idea, or finding an origin, a place in which you say, here's the people who started it, or who, and I think I would have started it differently, or maybe I would have started it in 6 different places. You can do this maybe with a movie. You can't quite do it with a novel. But instead of starting the book in ancient Egypt, I would have started it actually in the Hebrew Bible, and tried to show how so many of these ideas that we're talking about are part of the Hebrew biblical tradition itself. In other words, that instead of trying to say, it's very hard for us to imagine that anti-Judaism isn't something about those people we call Jews. And my book has nothing to do with Jews. It's all about how we've learned all of our basic categories about immortality and death, about spirit and flesh, about law and freedom, about letter and allegory. All of these basic categories to how we understand our cosmos are built out of thinking about Jews because of the way we've learned to read Scripture. And I think I should have started in the Hebrew Bible instead of in Egypt. No reviewer has pointed that out, but they should.
Okay, let me pause for a moment. Are there questions yet?
Thank you. I have a question for you, Mr. Nirenberg. Unfortunately, anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism has been a long theme throughout history. What in your work surprised you?
That's a really hard question. I mean, in some ways, everything surprised me because I knew so little. But I think what most surprised me was the way in which what happened with what we call modernity, what we call the chapter that that you like least, the chapters. What happens when we, as a progressive and increasingly enlightened society, who think we're overcoming superstition, which is what, remember, the Enlightenment philosophers were all about. Écraser l'enfant, crush superstition, crush ignorance. Well, like the Phi Beta Kappa Society. Crush ignorance. But how did they do it? They did it by calling ignorance Judaism. And again, they weren't talking about Jews. They were talking about Catholics, or Catholics talking about Protestants. They were talking about a political order, kingship. That's tyranny. All of these things, they called them Judaism. So at the moment that a society tries to imagine its best ideals, to revolutionize its way of thinking about the world, it changes a lot of things. It crushes lots of enfants, lots of superstition, but it does it by holding on to a really basic one. And throughout modernity, what surprised me was showing how all of these heroes of mine, like people like Hegel, right? People who are really foundational to how our disciplines of history and our sense of our world were created. Marx, I'm not saying Marx is my hero, but he was someone who really had a powerful insight about the world. How they built all of their revolutionary insights about the world. The French Revolution, too. How they did this by holding on to some new forms of that old idea. That surprised me. It's resistance. It's modernity.
I wondered about the idea of anti-Judaism in your book, whether it wasn't sort of a subset of the whole ongoing philosophical issue of, through the centuries, of flesh versus spirit, body versus soul. It seems to be that the Jews were associated with the earthly, with the carnal, with the material, whereas the good guys always thought of themselves as on the side of the spirit, of the transcendent, and that they would use the Jewish label as a way of darkening their opponents.
That's right. That's another. So I could have started the book somewhere else, with what they call the birth of the axial age, the birth of transcendence, the birth of what we call critical, the awareness that things that seem to be here because they're on the earth the way they look aren't necessarily the way they are in truth. Think Plato, right? That the things in the world are mere appearance, but the eternal, unchanging, true, immortal forms are not given to us on the earth. That's what you're describing, the things of the earth, flesh, and things eternal and undying and unchanging, spirit. And I could have started the book there with that perception, which is the basis of all, they sometimes called axial civilizations, all religions of transcendence, all cultures of transcendence. And the book coming out in June, can I? No.
Slip me the $20 later. I want to bring up the question of maybe, well, no, you jump in.
I'd just like to add one thing to what you said about if you had started with the Hebrew Bible, because that's the origin of so many things we have in European. It's also pretty much the origin of the novel. In my previous volume, I pointed out that there are sequences, like the book of Kings and Judges, that biblical scholars have called like historical novels, and they're really organized. I mean, back then, the only literature was mostly poetry. The Jews were the first one that wrote prose.
Well, here's where Auerbach ties us together. The
Yes,
representation
exactly.
of reality in Western literature
Right.
begins with that Hebrew Bible.
So you can thank the Hebrew Bible for inventing the novel in one sense too. There are sequences there, and even Job could be read as a
And it invented physics. Let there be light.
Well, let me talk about it, maybe a ticklish subject, religion. In Steve's book, it's very clear that he finds religion and scriptures offensive as having tamped down humanity, having enslaved us, you could probably describe it better, but that they have caused nothing but trouble and ill in the world. And in Doug's book, we have this, you give the little anecdote about Laplace going to Napoleon with his book on celestial mechanics and saying, and Napoleon says, well, where's the creator in all this? And Laplace saying, well, I saw no reason for such a hypothesis. Whereas religious issues are always, obviously in the initial chapters of your book, important throughout. And I mean, how do you feel about the place of religion in Western culture and having written these particular books? Do you feel, is there a place for God in quantum mechanics to start with? Yes? No?
Well, I'm a secular humanist, and I
well,
think
just say that. I mean,
yeah,
that's
I mean,
fine.
no, I mean, I think even though let me say one thing, okay? I think the naive anti-religionism in science, I'm not at all sympathetic to. I feel like religion is intrinsic to the growth of our culture, and that there was no strong division between cosmology and understanding what the world was like, and understanding, the afterlife and understanding social organization. This was all lumped together in early religion, so that it's naive to say, oh, imagine we could have just had this secular society for 5,000 years, and all this science developed under religion, basically religious times. So I'm against that point of view. However, I do think that the modern scientific worldview doesn't need that hypothesis of an external teleological creator, and that's really what we are saying, that's what we we do not believe in. So in that sense, it's not an open question to most scientists.
Steve, you take any opportunity you can to slam organized religion, scriptures, belief in God.
Yes. One thing that occurred to me as I was writing this history of the novel is...
The novel is, in fact, is against...
Exactly. Every culture has its sacred scriptures, and I came to realize that literature is the secular scriptures. And there's two competing ways of explaining culture and how we should live. The sacred scriptures tell us this is one way to live. So the novelists and poets come along and say, well, let's try those out. Let's write stories about people in those situations. Thou shalt not steal. Okay, well, what if Les Miserables, someone has to steal to feed his family? Novelists and poets were trying out these rather dire prohibitions, and I think that writers and poets have a better understanding of how the world actually works and what people are like than the rather totalitarian, sometimes religious pronouncements. And I saw those, I was just praising the Bible a while ago. I mean, all the sacred scriptures have some interesting passages in it and various great ideas, and I understand religion's appeal as a community. I mean, we all need that, and it's a binding. Okay, fine, but I just think that literature offers a much more, just as science, as a more accurate sense of how the world works and why it works than mythologies that were invented, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. And that does run through my books, so I'll have to warn you, if you're a fundamentalist, don't read my books. You'll hate it. You'll hate it.
Don't you think that Christianity kind of, was the first kind of, not the first, but a real step forward in philosophical reasoning about relationships between people and societies? I mean, that was a true change between the Old and New Testament.
Christian Science started off with, they were thought the world was ending in about 20, 30 years. And they told people, don't get married if you're already married because the end is coming. It was an apocalyptic, this is better than I do. Christianity started off as an apocalyptic warning that the world was ending, and it didn't, so then they started coming up with theology, and it started getting more complicated. But, and of course, you can use that argument, without Christianity, we wouldn't have Bach. We wouldn't have the great music that was written, the great paintings and all that.
I'm not sure we would have Rawls or Kant or any of these people.
You could take that argument, but this is obviously a very complicated question, so maybe we should...
I think the general argument would be that we should value people over theories and abstractions. That the reality, the world as it is more important than some imaginary or perhaps possible other realm. We should live here. It's this kind of tension that runs through your book. When I read the chapter on Islam, it was extremely depressing because you seem to say, you seem to say, apparently there can not possibly be for any Islamic believer peace in the Middle East. The Jew is an enemy.
I don't say that.
I mean, when the Quran, as you portray the Quran, it doesn't leave you really many opportunities. When Muhammad was dying, he said there could be no two religions in the land. There has to only be one. The portrait that the Quran has of anti-Judaic portraits seemed quite devastating. It's hard to see how people can recover from those.
No, I don't. Well,
You may disagree.
Maybe it's like you saying, I didn't say about strange action. No, I think that that the Quran has, and all of our sacred texts have many positions in them about just about anything. Not only do they have many positions in them in what seems to be their plain sense. Mm-hmm. So the Quran has many different teachings about how to treat the people of the book, how to treat Jews, how to treat Christians, how to treat Zoroastrians, or how to treat people you conquer in war. Many different teachings. But it also has many different potential meanings based on how we read it. And every historical community, almost every individual can read it to some degree differently. And those different readings have created tremendous change across the change from a community that really did think, as Paul says, very little time remaining, to a community that sees itself as a religion of empire. Christianity became a religion of empire. How does that happen? By rereading Scripture, by focusing on different passages of it, by interpreting them differently. Christianity went from a religion that emphasize, you know that the Gospel of Luke tells you to love your enemy and offer him your other cheek. I know you know that. But you may not know that it also says, as for my enemies and those who have denied my sovereignty, bring them here and slay them before me. And for some 1,500 years, Christian theologians paid a lot of attention to that, slay them before me. We don't anymore. That's because we read these texts differently. They all contain the Quran, the Islamic tradition, the Christian, the Jewish, all contain many different potentials.
I would agree with that, but I was surprised by how negative the portrait was throughout that third chapter, and doesn't really leave an opening. Not at least a very obvious opening, at least to me. But I could have read it too quickly.
No. You're right. I mean, I think what I was trying to show in the Quran chapter, that I know Islam is a topic that's very important to the world today. And Islamic-Jewish relations, Islamic-Christian relations is very important. And one of the arguments that's often made about the Muslim world is that until the coming of European thought through colonialism, they didn't know any of these topics. Anti-Judaism was alien to Islam. And what I was trying to show was that early Islam was formed by the same kind of thinking about prophecy that early Christianity was. And so that potential has been there, has been activated at different times in history. It's not, yes, it is affected by colonialism, but it's not invented by Europe and given to Islam.
We should do another question. Audience? Yes? No?
See, I saw the one in the back first.
Okay.
This is a bit more personal rather than intellectual question, although it may get an intellectual answer or three answers. It's to all three of our esteemed book award winners tonight. Obviously, at this point, your books are published. They've been well regarded. You've won awards. During the long period of time when you were gestating, and giving birth to these books, was there a moment or a set of moments or a period where there were so many difficulties and challenges that you doubted? And if so, how did you get beyond them?
The metaphor of gestation and birth makes me think that the toughest point was the episiotomy, but and yours is a big book.
No, slouchy.
No. So one good thing to be said for Kindle is that you can't tell how many pages long a book is on Kindle.
That's also the thing you can say against it.
No, but I'm sure we each have a story, and I do want to say it is very lonely work. Working, how many years did you work?
Only 5.
5, 7, 10.
His whole
10.
life.
So we go up in. It's very lonely work, and I can only say that I never wanted to share my work with anybody because I thought this is not a story anybody wants to hear. My reputation was built on something very different, telling a different kind of story about the three religions. And so personally, I'd say that struggling with a book you don't want to write on a subject that is grim, and that all writing is done alone, it's not an accident that for about 2,000 years, the stereotype about writers has been that they're melancholic.
I didn't have the problem exactly for the reason I said earlier. I gave myself permission to have fun with this. If I had written the standard academic one, I would have had what you explained, and doldrums, and there were certain sections I wasn't so excited about. You know, the 17th century French heroic romance. It was kind of boring.
Favorite.
These are like 3,000-page long romances where nothing. It was like a mountain range I had to get over to get to the good stuff. But again, even those novels I kind of had fun with and kind of made fun. So the fact that I trusted my own voice and gave myself permission to have fun with it saved me from that problem. And that's advice I would give any budding writers out there.
Doug, this was your first novel. Not novel, but your first book. Are you inspired now to go on to another?
Definitely. It's very, very rewarding activity. And what I wanted to say, so I was doing so many other things. So when I say 7 years, probably it was more like 2 years of a year and a half of work because I had so many other obligations. And I was continually reading it to my wife and my father and people, and it was fun. We were having fun with it. And the thing that resonated with what you said, every time in writing the book, I said, look, I write these kind of very structured, staid, scientific articles. Every time I have a chance to take a risk, I'm going to take a risk. Like starting this Solvay chapter totally backwards and confusing the reader, but maybe amusing them eventually. So by doing it that way, it was really what funny thing, I had fun with the titles. I don't know, my favorite chapter title was about the chemist Walter Nernst, who was a very self-important guy, and it was the importance of being Nernst. So you have fun with that, and so I really didn't struggle. I had so many other things that distracted me. It wasn't going well. What I want to say about this, which was surprising and just so great that I'm really hooked, is that, and you guys probably are used to this, I write papers and people write and they say, oh, this is a really interesting paper, I see them in the conference. But I would get these like paeans of praise from people I never heard of through the internet, just in an email saying, I just thought I understand, this is the best book about Einstein. I understand. I was like, oh my God, your heart melts, and I'm reaching people in a more visceral, emotional way.
Wait till the snarky attacks come.
Yeah, well, they're going to. Okay, right. And conversely, I was expecting, someone would say something horrible about the book, and I would be like your kid, I'm sure,
Yeah.
and it's horrible. That didn't happen because I didn't get reviewed except by the scientists. They all loved it. There's only the guy that loved Tesla on Amazon who said, Einstein had stolen everything from Tesla. But other than a few cranks, I didn't have much of that. But the rewarding nature of that, and I know, you see the power of literature. I really want to say this to you guys. There are many writers here. The power of literature, you move people and they write you because they're moved. It's just amazing.
This leads into my, at one point early on in the second volume, you talk about the function, the purpose of reading is not pedagogy or something didactic. It's aesthetic bliss. Aesthetic bliss. What do you mean by, I know when we also talk about experiments being beautiful experiments or beautiful proofs, and I imagine there's some sort of equivalent for, history or intellectual history of beauty of argument or documents. How important is the notion that your work or of aesthetic bliss is in it? What do you mean by that?
I mean just the sign of something really put well together. Anyone can tell a story, anyone can whistle a song, anyone can dance. Artists are people who can do this better than anyone else. And when you study something, rather than just read it or listen to it, you're trying to figure out why is it so well made? Why is it, and it's a sense of aesthetics, how the form works together, the rhythm, the language, the diction. All of that creates a sense of,
Pleasure of the text.
Yeah, this chair right here, for example. It looks like a chair, but we could pick it up and look at it and see how it's built. And if it's really well built, you'd have a sense of something that's just well constructed. And that's what aesthetics come from. And that's what separates the good books from the bad. I think Oscar Wilde once said there's no such thing as, good books are bad. They're just either well written or not.
Yeah.
And he was speaking about the aesthetic. It's not the message or whether you can identify with the characters. It's the aesthetic construction. Is it well put together? And
is that true for experiments? What makes an aesthetically pleasing theory? I guess some of the idea of the theories that the Wien or the before Planck or something, they just didn't quite work. They seemed to not only have logical and mathematical flaws, as they almost seemed to be aesthetically flawed.
Yeah. Well, definitely things that seem to sort of, the elegance usually is that lots of different things all get explained by one thing.
Elegance.
I can completely eliminate this, So something that generalizes and, kind of collects a lot of phenomena in one kind of unified picture, and then you say, oh, that's beautiful. And you do say that as a physicist. Even on more minor things than Einstein's general relativity, which is once a century, but just in things that we do, you say, oh, that's beautiful. How did you think of that? That makes it all so much simpler and, more well constructed. So it is a matter of workmanship and, this idea of the well-written book is what matters. And people definitely have that in science too. Same thing with an experiment. Experiment, you may say, oh, there's all these noise sources. I'm going to somehow design something that's going to cancel all these out so that the thing that made the experiment looked hard is now completely kind of absent because I've set up these counterbalancing, things, and I'll just subtract one from the other, and all those extraneous things will cancel out. And then you say, oh, that's brilliant, because we've thought about it for a long time, and suddenly the answer comes. So there is that notion, and the expert understands it, more than it's harder to explain to the non-expert.
David, is there any kind of equivalent for an historian? Do you have a sense when ideas come together, or documents?
I think it's different for every historian. I think the cliche about historians is the one well represented in Harry Potter. I think you remember that the history instructor is the only one who's actually dead. But for me, and this is different from many, for example, many historians love character. They love to choose a historical character and develop it. So historical biography is it. For me, what I love about writing history is language. And for me, the referent that's always in my head when I'm writing is poetry, not history. So, a reviewer just upbraided me for not citing T.S. Eliot's poetry in my book. He didn't read closely enough in the sense, I don't cite the poetry, but I certainly had, like the word estaminet. The word estaminet is in the book. Where else does that come from if not the love song of the Alfred Prufrock? But that kind of using all the changes we have in our head with language so that even a history book, I think every sentence should carry the aesthetic pleasure which comes not just from seeing that it's well made, but also from suddenly discovering a new potential in the language, something that you didn't know that word could do. And I think, now I know historians who write their books as if they were memoranda, but I think history should be written as if it were literature.
Well, I think on that note, we should thank our guests again for being part of this conversation. Congratulate them. And